Good day, my name is Bob Nisbet, your host for an interview with Jody Wiser, founder of Tax Fairness Oregon. Jody, welcome to Tualatin Valley Community TV.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Now, Jody, we're here to talk about ballot measure 84 that what people will be voting on shortly in November. Would you like to explain measure 84 to us?
Well, Measure 84 is talked about as the estate tax repeal measure, basically. And it does phase out the estate tax so that it's eliminated by 2016. But it also has another provision that basically phases out capital gains tax for people who want to jump through the loophole that the measure creates. So it's basically, it's two new tax breaks that'll be used by the top 2%.
Has Oregon had an estate tax for a long time?
We've had it for longer than we've had an income tax. We've had an estate tax for 109 years. We've had an estate tax.
So who pays an estate tax? What percentage?
2% of Oregonians pay the estate tax. Each year, on average, 32,000 people die out of the, 2.8 million Oregonians. And of the 32,000 who die, about 700 families pay the estate tax. So it's not, it's hitting the wealthiest 2%. And you have to be millionaires to pay this tax. You have to have, a family has to have more than $2 million to pay any estate tax at all.
Well, how does that work since people don't usually die at the same time?
So if, suppose you and I were married and we had an estate that's worth, we had about $3 million. What we would probably do is plan that when whichever one of us goes first, we will pass all of the assets to the other person. And along with the assets goes our $1 million exemption. So when the second person dies, there's $2 million that's exempt, and there would be $1 million left that would pay the estate tax. Mm-hmm. And the tax on that million, you hear all the stuff about the estate tax is gonna, rob you blind, blah, blah, blah. Well, the tax on that last bit is $101,000.
101 out of 3
million,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So these poor, unlucky heirs, instead of getting $3 million, they're going to get $2.9 million. 9 million, yeah. I was at a lecture earlier tonight, and somebody talked about, sometimes we call it paying back, but it's also actually paying it forward. Mm-hmm. The people who have had success are trying to lay some groundwork for someone besides their own children to have success in the future. Mm-hmm. When they pay the estate tax.
So why does Tax Fairness Oregon oppose Measure 84?
Well, we oppose it because we believe it's a fair tax to begin with, that nobody does well in our society without all of the structures of that society. I mean, the farm I grew up on, there wouldn't have been electricity or roads to that farm without the government. So obviously we couldn't have been successful without the government. And then I went through public grade school and high school and public university, and I actually worked in the public spheres for many years. So obviously the structures of the society give me and everybody else that has success, and they need to help pay for that. And that's part of what the estate tax does. Mm-hmm. It also provides a significant amount of revenue. And the proponents of this measure will say, well, it's only 1.5% of the state's budget, the state's general fund, but that 1.5% will buy a week of school.
For all of Oregon public
for
schools?
For all 540,000 public school kids in Oregon. Mm-hmm. It'll pay for a week of school. Well, we already have, I think it's the second or third shortest week in the country. So do we want to take another week away and hand it to families that are already doing really well? Or do we want to leave some weeks of education for everybody's kids? Mm-hmm.
So wasn't the estate tax changed in the last legislative session, and if so, what was done?
There have been changes made over a series of years, but there was a big change that was made in the last session. And a number of things were changed. changed the year of the federal code that we're connected with. They lowered the interest rate if you if you enter into a payment plan for your estate taxes. If you can't pay it all at once because you're a business that doesn't have the money, you can pay over 14 years. So they lowered the interest rate for that. But the major thing they did was create or continue really creating a program that makes it so that small, medium, and rather large farms and forest families would pay no estate tax on those farm and forest assets. And actually the legislature, I think when they did that, thought that they were, you know, saying, okay, we understand that it's hard on these farm families and we value the fact that some of them produce food, not just nursery stock, and we want to do this, but it didn't do any good, because that's the talking point of this campaign largely.
Well, this was my next question: was farmers going to suffer from this tax and not be able to pass on their property to their children? Why are farmers some of the chief petitioners on this measure?
I think farmers are chief petitioners because somehow they get to everybody's heart differently than, I mean, what kind of a storyline is this? Well, we can't do this. It's making people give up their cash. That just doesn't work.
Right.
But they might have to sell the family farm. That is a convincing line. In fact, I think it's 4% of estates even have any farm assets in them. So it's not who really pays most of the tax. Mostly what's in estates is stocks and bonds and homes and other real estate and cash, and then small business and farm assets. They make up about 10% of the total assets of what's in taxable estates.
So are there examples of people who have lost their farms to the estate tax as it exists today?
No, and there's not even examples of people who lost it as it existed before, when we didn't have all these other provisions. They're, you know, they've been looking. I saw an email that went out in the Farm Bureau several years ago saying, do we have any examples? And nobody had any examples. I did have a investment advisor once say to me that his situation was an example, that his wife, you know, they inherited the family farm and they had to sell it because of the taxes. And I said, really? You were planning to give up your business and move to Eastern Oregon, where this farm was? And he goes, well, no. I said, so you didn't actually, you just wanted to own the family farm. And then, so why didn't you? And he said, well, because by the time we paid, you know, a ranch manager, we wouldn't have made any money. And so I said, so really you sold the farm because it wasn't going to be profitable enough? And he admitted that was actually true. But, you know, so you do hear stories sometimes. But generally speaking, if you think about it, the farm has been supporting the elders generation and the now middle-aged generation that's running the farm. And the parents die, and the money that was supporting the parents can be used to pay the tax. And especially since we allow the tax to be paid over 14 years, it's a possibility.
Right.
But it's a heartwarming story.
Right. So what can you tell me about Chief Petitioner Gerald Freeman, who's a farmer?
Well, that's an interesting case because he's one of the chief petitioners for this measure. And so I did some research, and he and his wife own 234 acres in Rickerall. They're not inside the urban growth boundary. They're not inside a city. So their land is in a farm use only area, so it can only be sold as farmland. He has, there's a quarry that they don't seem to be using anymore, and he has some trees and he has some grain. There is no way that farm would be worth $15 million. So he's not going to pay the estate tax unless he has a lot of money someplace else. You know, unless he's made a whole bunch of money in the market or won the lottery or something like that.
But it's not the farm asset.
Right, that's outside the farm asset. Because if he had, you know, if the farm is worth $4 million and he had $5 million in a in an investment account, then he would have to pay taxes on the farm, on the whole thing. But he really does seem to be a farmer, and if he really is a farmer, then he's not going to pay. We've already exempted him from paying the estate tax on that farm property, and there's no worry about passing it on. He was asked in an interview by Kristen Fotovinsel, so how much is your farm worth? And he said, well, I haven't had it appraised.
Right.
And it's like, yes, but every farmer pays attention when any land nearby sells, and they know what their farm is worth. He just didn't want to say that it's only worth, $1 million. The typical farm in Oregon is worth $900,000. That's the average size farm. So this is not they would, without a provision, they wouldn't have been paying estate tax in all likelihood, most farms. So really, the state has exempted them, and they're still being used as the,
as the shining examples of people who are going to be hurt by
right.
this tax.
Right.
When there are no examples of farmers who've been hurt by this tax.
Right. Instead, it's going to be somebody's going to have to sell some of their Johnson & Johnson stock to pay the tax. That's the reality. That's how it is for most families. But it doesn't make a good story when you're trying to sell a measure.
Okay. And what about small business owners? They're also a group that would like to pay no estate tax.
Some small business owners are in that, of that mind. I was just in the room tonight with about 50 people that are small business owners, part of the Equity Alliance of Oregon, and that's not their position at all. That's just the position of the kind of people that Kevin Mannix, who's the guy behind this bill, that's who he trots out, to talk about it. Is we're not gonna know what to do. We're not gonna be able to pass it on. But in fact, businesses do pass on. I mean, Family Farm is a good example. We have almost 1,200 century-old family farms in Oregon. Well, the estate tax has been here for that century, and those farms have all persisted. So obviously it's possible. But sometimes families don't choose to continue farming.
So there are actually plenty of wealthy people who support the estate tax and understand that it's a contribution for Oregon in general. Yeah.
Well, we understand that what's in estates is a lot of it is often untaxed, never been taxed assets. Because, for instance, you buy some stock and you hold it, and it's had a lot of capital gains, and that gain has never been taxed. But it's not going to be easy for your kids to figure out what you paid for your house and what changes you've had to it, and so it makes better sense to just tax the whole thing. And particularly with a couple having $2 million tax-free, that covers the part that has been taxed recently.
So I've read in some articles that people complain that the estate tax is a double tax. You've made the money, perhaps it was income, you paid some tax on it at that time, and now you die and you have to pay a tax on it again.
You do.
And how do you address that from a fairness point of view?
So statistically, we know from the Congressional Research Service that in looking at taxable federal estates at a time when their estate size was closer to ours, the $1 million exemption, they estimate that roughly half of what's in estates has never been taxed. It's that capital gains that hasn't been taxed. And anyway, in our culture and in most cultures with a monetary system and a government, you tax things when there is transition. So you work for somebody and they pay you, but they pay tax, and then you get the money and you pay tax, and then you take it to the grocery store and spend it, and guess what? The grocery store pays tax, and then the grocery store takes it to his supplier, to buy some product, and the supplier pays tax. So what's the difference when the transition is between you and your child rather than you and your boss? It's the same thing. It's a transition tax.
So is there any provision to replace the money left that would no longer be collected from the estate tax with other money?
There's absolutely nothing in Measure 84 that would replace the estate tax currently brings in about $100 million a year, and there's nothing to replace it. The proponents propose that there's going to be a whole bunch of new jobs because we don't have an estate tax anymore, and those new jobs will, you know, pay taxes, income taxes, and that'll somehow replace it. But of course, if trickle down worked, well, we've been having low taxes now for 12 years basically, and instead of being awash with jobs, we're seeking jobs. So obviously, low taxes is not the way to get jobs or increase tax revenue.
So the other part of this measure, besides the estate tax, there's a provision that would define an estate tax as a tax imposed on the transfer of property within families, regardless of whether there's a death or not. What's that about?
Well, I think that's about families never having to pay tax. People who don't want to pay tax never have to. The way the provision is written, if you have something that you want to transfer to your child, or you just are ready to get rid of, you can sell it to your child. And you can sell it to them at its current market value. And there's no tax because it was between you and your child.
Within your family.
Within your family. So that's saying it's a special relationship. You shouldn't have to pay tax when it's between you and your family. But there's also, and that doesn't make any sense to me. You know, if I sell my house to my son, how is that different than my selling my house to my neighbor? If I'm going to get $500,000 for it, I should pay any gain that I might need to pay. But the thing that's really missing from the provision is anything about whether they can turn around the next day and sell the house or not.
And in fact, they could.
They can. Yeah, if I've actually sold the house to my sister or to my son, and they've given me an IOU saying I owe you money, then they can turn around and sell it the next day, and when they get the money, they can pay the IOU off, and we've just avoided taxes. So I've lived in my house for 34 years, so there's a lot more gain in my house than the exemption that one gets. And so if I sold my house tomorrow, I would owe quite a bit of capital gains tax on it. So that's why I use the house. But actually, it could be stocks. It could be, if you sell cattle, that's usually a capital gains event. So a farmer that has 100 head of cattle that he's selling could use this provision to avoid taxes.
Sell it within his family. Family sells it.
Could decide to sell it, next week.
All right.
And so because the first sale was between in the family, even though there was that's where the gain was, there would be no tax there. And then when it was sold outside the family, there wouldn't be any particular gain, and so there'd be no tax there. So it's a giant loophole for people who have anything with a lot of gain that they want to sell.
And so the state would lose capital gains in this case, this capital gains tax, and you have any idea, an estimate of how much that would be?
Well, it's pretty hard to guess how much it would be used. But we know that on average we collect about $400 million a year. So say only half the time it was used. If you have a commercial building to sell with $2 million worth of profit in it, everybody would say you were stupid if you didn't use this technique, and yet you would be avoiding taxes on $2 million worth of profit. So that would be a nice hunk of money and a good incentive to do it. If you were selling something that you didn't have much profit on, you probably wouldn't bother. So, for sure, we've got the $100 million of estate tax at risk. And my guess is that this loophole, the capital gains loophole, will actually cost us more than the estate tax.
Right.
A CPA or a tax attorney could be sued if he didn't talk to his client about it, because it's his fiduciary responsibility to tell them about the ways they can save money. And so it wouldn't be big at the beginning probably, but it would over time.
So are Measure 84 backers concerned about the funding hole that Measure 84 would create?
No,
No?
no. They have the magic of somehow it's going to create jobs.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they have a piece of economic research by some Oregon economists that probably would fail if it was presented to a junior level economics class that says that somehow this will create 31 to 44,000 jobs. But it doesn't make sense. When people retire, most of the money is in the stock market, and that doesn't create jobs except for a few accountants and stuff. You know, I mean, when people are at the retiring age, they're not creating new businesses, generally speaking, so they're not going to be creating jobs with it. And you know, you only get your windows washed and your oil changed so many times. It doesn't really go up. You don't buy a whole lot more after you get to a certain level of affluence.
So the opposition talks about 31 states getting rid of their estate taxes. Does the estate tax make Oregon non-competitive?
That's an interesting claim because on the West Coast, Washington State and Oregon have estate taxes, and the states around us don't. And you know, right here in the paper, I think this is Wednesday's paper, yesterday's paper. Oregon is 6th in the nation for growing new businesses. So obviously, it's not keeping people from coming here that we have an estate tax to start a business. People are I mean, we're 6th in the nation for starting businesses, so it's not affecting us. And on top of that, I mean, it isn't how people make business decisions. Taxes aren't how they do that. They decide where they want to be or where they are already, and then they start doing what they're doing, generally speaking. It's just a let's compete with each other and race to the bottom kind of thing that is used commonly to try to lower taxes.
So why promote a ballot measure to eliminate one tax when all taxes should be on the table? I read that the Governor Kitzhaber is trying to get a bipartisan support for comprehensive tax reform. So we could look at all the different kind of taxes rather than this narrow segment of taxes.
Well, Mannix isn't in conversation with the governor about what he should do. I think that is where it begins. I mean, Mannix has to make a living, and this is how he does it, is by doing initiatives. And at one of the debates we were at together, he said, you know, a few years ago, a group of farmers came to me and said, you know, we're really bothered by this estate tax, and when you see what you can do about it. And I thought, well, they went to the legislature too, and the legislature solved the problem. Unless you have a farm or an estate worth more than $30 million, a couple can pass on $15 million worth of farm or forest business tax-free, including their houses and up to $1 million worth of cash. So that, you know, it's like he didn't notice that this bill went through the legislature and passed, and yet he was there testifying about the bill. There's just a disconnect between, I'm out here to win this measure because I'm trying to underfund government. I want government to fail, and it's a job.
So when Jill Stein was in Portland, she's the Green Party candidate for president, she said the Republican basic stance is that rich people are not rich enough. Is that a little bit of what's going on here?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, you know, the wealth divide just isn't big enough yet.
Right.
Right. We haven't gotten the salaries low enough yet. I mean, you know, it's astounding the growth in the amount of assets of this country that has gone to the top 1%. And this measure is a measure for those very people, because it's not only the estate tax, which only the top 2% pay, but then there's also this capital gains loophole, and 75% of all capital gains is earned by the top 2%. So you might think you have some capital gains here and there, and you know, other people might think they have some capital gains, but really they don't have much, because they don't own office towers downtown or, you know, major businesses and that have a whole lot of value, or millions of dollars worth of stock.
So we're pretty close to wrapping it up. Do you have any last message to the voters out there?
Vote no on 84. That'd be my last message to them. Unless you really think that the top 2% are the ones that are suffering in this state, and that we should do everything we can for them, then you should be voting no, because this will take money out of our state and it'll take it away from everything from teachers to troopers, everything. It goes directly into the general fund. And that's where the money comes. Most of it goes to education. And we all have been hearing about how expensive college is, how much debt kids leave college with. We know that salaries are stagnated, that the public isn't participating in the we're becoming more efficient all the time. Our productivity is going up, but the rewards of the workers' productivity is going to the owners instead of to the salary earners. And so it's like this measure is just to get the rich richer.
Okay, so vote no on Measure 84, and thank you very much, Jody Wiser, Tax Fairness Oregon, for coming into Tualatin Valley Community TV.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.